Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Your podcast. My name is Michelle, and I'm a writer. And the reason I'm doing this podcast is because I feel really passionately about politics in South Africa. I really want to know what is actually going on in this country so that when we go to the polls, we are actually informed about the issues facing this country. I feel like a lot of us are walking around just like, not really sure what's actually going on. The headlines are super complicated to understand. A lot of us are just like, wafting around pretending that we really understand, example, why we're dealing with load shedding, whether or not there is actually corruption happening, who's doing the corruption, who's doing the corruptioning, why the corruptioning is happening. We're not really sure about those kinds of things. All we know is a lot of people are just like, oh no, we don't like the ANC, we don't like this party. But I really want to get to the bottom of a lot of the issues, especially for young people, and figure out what is going on, which is why I'm doing this podcast. I've done a few podcast episodes before with my best friend Jody, and now I'm doing it by myself, and we're doing it on a YouTube platform, but then also on a podcast platform, so you can access the content in many different ways. Today, we're going to talk about public transport in South Africa. It's really bad, and I really want to get to the bottom of this and figure out why we have a problem with public transport in South Africa. In other countries, public transport really works well, and the impact of a well working public transport infrastructure is astounding. Like, it can change people's lives and it changes the way that we do things. And I really think that one of the big problems that we have is that our public transport doesn't work. Now, it hasn't been working for a very long time. For some of us, we've grown up with really shitty public transport, and we've never questioned why we have to constantly drive, why we constantly have to be in traffic, and why our roads are so full all the time. But there are reasons for these things, and so I decided I was going to figure out why, and this is basically the culmination of that research. I'm passionate about this because I firmly believe in public transport and its ability to be an agent for change. Good public transport infrastructure transforms the economy into a thriving industry. It changes the game. And when people can travel anywhere safely, easily, and conveniently, so much more is possible economically. Without robust infrastructure, transport is slow, it takes a long time to get things done, and business is sluggish. I think this is really, really important for us to understand. But first, let's look at the history of public transport in South Africa. Well, what's funny about this is that Metro Rail has a entire history of the rail system in South Africa on their website, and you can just go and look at the whole thing. I'm focusing on rail transport in this episode and not so much on taxis and buses, because those, I think the rail transport is sort of the crux of the issue here and the most important thing to sort out because of its propensity to make things much, much, much better and easier for everyone. Bus services in South Africa are largely privatized, and so the taxi industry. The taxi industry is a much bigger issue that I do not have the space to cover today, so we're focusing on rail transport. On to the history. The railway system dates back to the 1850s when the concept of rail transport was proposed for the Cape and Natal colonies. Private companies pioneered the first railway systems with the building of a 92-kilometer line from Cape Town to Wellington and the Durban Point line. Again, it wasn't government who pioneered the system, it was private individuals, which I think says a lot about sort of just the trajectory in South Africa of how things get done. It's not the government who takes charge, it's actually regular, ordinary South Africans who decide to make a change, and then that becomes the breaking point and how everything just flows from there, which I think is quite interesting in the case of like pre-apartheid 1850 South Africa. Even then the government wasn't coming up with this idea, it was regular South African citizens. The rest of the history is like pretty boring and I'm not going to get into it, but eventually the rail system becomes state owned and it becomes an SOE, kind of like Telkom and Eskom. But let's look at the history of public transport on a global scale and how really important that was. From a National Geographic article that I read on transportation and its effects on the economy. In America, advances in travel and transport helped drive settlement in the western regions of North America and were integral to the nation's industrialization. Busy transport links stimulated the growth of cities, especially New York and Chicago, but also strategically located towns like Buffalo, Cleveland, Ohio, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, St. Louis, Missouri. The transportation system allowed Americans to take advantage of the continent's vast territory and natural resources and to build an industrial economy on a national scale. In general history, the railroad literally changed the world. And in another article from the AARP, which is the largest nonprofit, nonpartisan organization dedicated to empowering Americans 50 years and older to choose how they live as they age. Okay, dude. Anyway, from the AARP, from their start in England in 1830, railroads spread like kudzu across the globe. They unified countries, created great fortunes, enabled the growth of new industries, and thoroughly revolutionized life in every place they ran. So here we can see that railroad transport is really, really important, and we need to get behind it and understand this concept. Because growing up, I thought the train did not exist anymore. I thought it was an antiquated mode of transport until I figured out that it actually still is alive and thriving, but it's just so severely underutilized in this country, and it's a big issue. And now, unfortunately, we have to get into the major problems with public transport in South Africa, specifically focusing on the train, metro rail, or as lots of South Africans like to call it, metro fail. So I used to take the train. So I was trying to cut down, I didn't have a car, and I was trying to cut down the transport from that area to another area, which is quite far. So if I were to drive, it probably would have taken me maybe an hour in peak traffic. But with the train, it was meant to be about 30 minutes long. However, because of delays with public transport, especially with metro rail, the trains are on never, ever, 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 ever on time. They're often like 20, 30 minutes late. Sometimes the train comes and it's too full, so you physically can't get on it and you have to wait 20 minutes for the next train, if that train ever arrives. Sometimes the trains get stuck and you basically need to they'll make an announcement, if they make an announcement, and tell you that you need to cross over to another platform. And when you get to that platform, sometimes the train will be arriving within the next 2 minutes. They'll make the announcement, and within 2 minutes, you need to be on the next platform, which is quite far away. So what happens is people end up jumping onto the railway tracks and running across the railway tracks in their high heels with school bags. Some people are architects or artists and they have these huge other cases that they have to carry. Some people are carrying business goods, like selling stuff, and you'll just see all of this chaos, like 1,000 people crossing the platform to get to the next train, and hopefully it'll get there on time and get them to where they need to be. I've heard of people getting into trouble for getting to work late every single day because the trains are late. The impact this has on the average South African citizen and their overall productivity cannot be understated. And that is why I've chosen to speak about this topic, because it's been a simmering issue that I've been looking at and being like, why doesn't this work? It's so easy. So I went and looked at the research, and there's a lot online about the problems with public transport. In one article in the South African Labour Bulletin titled Unsafe and Inefficient Public Transport Endangers Our Lives, authors note that the lack of scheduling makes transport difficult, which I've just explained. I remember this being the bane of my existence. And there's very little communication to passengers about delays. So oftentimes you'll be standing on the platform, the train will be 30 minutes late, there is no one to talk to. I also recently found out that actually the train drivers are lucky if they can communicate with different stations. Like if you happen to have the WhatsApp number for whoever runs another station, then you can communicate that there's been a breakdown. Otherwise, they just have no means of communicating with each other, which is astounding. How is this problem not being fixed? How is it possible that the train driver can never communicate with the next station at all? Then there's our very own president who also got stuck on a train. And this happened a few years ago, and it was embarrassing.
Good morning to you. Are you stuck with the president?
Yes, indeed, that is the case. We're going to try and squeeze through here. As we've been telling you throughout the morning that the train has been packed. You have a couple of other people who have managed to get off the train now as they make their way to the various destinations. And there you have it, the president of the country. Mr. President, it's been over, 2 hours now since we've been on this train?
2.5.
2.5 hours, yeah.
Almost coming on to getting to 3 hours. 7:30 we boarded, so it's almost 3 hours now.
He looks so awkward and upset, but it's like, how did he get on that train, be stuck for 3 hours, and then still do nothing about it afterwards? I mean, he made a statement saying that heads will roll, blah, 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 blah. But aren't we stuck with the same problem even now? And it's been years. How do you take that train, have that journey, and not have it completely wreck your life? Like, I don't understand how you were so blasé about it. Obviously, the privilege is privileging. Another problem with the train, especially when it comes to the inefficiency of this train, is the mental health impacts. Well, research shows that physical strain experienced by workers whilst commuting affected their ability to function effectively compared to individuals that do not share similar challenges. So people who don't take the train, who don't have a super long commute, are often better off mentally, especially at work, compared to people who do take the train. And then there's the unique way that transport is experienced by women. This changes the entire game, and as a woman, I was completely overwhelmed and on edge the entire time I took Metro Rail. I was robbed on the train. I've seen people being robbed on the train. Traveling alone as a woman during off-peak hours is basically asking to get robbed, which is not something that is fair to say, because everybody should be able to take the train and not be robbed and arrive at their destination safely. But as a woman, your experience is markedly different. When women wait longer to access public transport due to a lack of clear scheduling, they also become vulnerable to gender-based violence. The public transport industry is known for its culture of abuse that places women at the risk of violence. Then there was an interview from the Orange Farm who mentioned that some taxi drivers stop to buy alcohol, and I cannot say anything because I'm a woman. They look at your body and promise to beat you up. In some cases, these taxi drivers are drug users, and this affects how women passengers are treated. And this is from the Labour Bulletin. But let's look at the deeper implications of a rotten public transport infrastructure. Now, there's an activism group called #UniteBehind, and they basically campaign for rights of citizens and access to equitable resources from a bunch of different things. One of their campaigns at the moment is called #FixOurTrains. They're doing a really, really great job. What their work involves is a lot of court cases, going to court and having their voices, having their case heard formally in court, because in South Africa, that's the best way to make sure you're heard. Unfortunately, that means that court cases and lawyers cost money. So if you have any resources available, consider donating to organizations like Unite Behind, because they're campaigning for our rights and all of our rights, not just the privileged few. They also have resources on their website, and one of these resources is a report on Metro Rail detailing the problems with Metro Rail and what needs to be done to fix it. So they've said that the Metro Rail crisis is so deep that around 43% of former passengers, which is around 248,500, have stopped using the trains over the past 4 years. Now, taxi ranks and bus stations are overburdened, leading to long queues whilst traffic gets even worse. It's easy to see why people have stopped using the trains. Most are not on time, and that's if they arrive at the station at all. Over 73% of trains are late, and that figure increases depending on your line. Some more fun facts for you guys. 30% of households in South Africa own a car, with the other 70%, 70%, depending on taxis, buses, and trains, and other non-motorized transport modes. So some people are actually just walking to where they want to be because they can't take the train, they can't take the bus because they don't have money for it, perhaps. And this is astounding. 70% of people have to rely on public transport, and it's so inefficient. How are you able to get anything done if that's the only way that you can rely on getting things done? And then people wonder why we have like such a huge crisis on our hands. I mean, hello. The global benchmark for how much a person from a developing country should spend on public transport is 10% of a commuter's income. But in South African metros, this figure sits as high as 50.4%, while the country's rural area is just over 20%. So not only is our transport system inefficient, but we're also overspending on it. So we're spending way more than we should, sometimes half of our income, just to get around. And now, unfortunately, we have to talk about the Group Areas Act. This is a very old apartheid law that went into place where basically government came in, removed people from populous areas, especially central districts and economic hubs, and moved them out into rural or further away spaces where they weren't able to access these services anymore. They pushed out Black, brown, and other non-white people from economic hubs and central areas so that those spaces could be allocated to white people only. The problem with the Group Areas Act is that it's never been rectified or shifted, so historically poorer people and poorer communities are still disadvantaged because they're still living in those areas. And those areas often have never been developed to create its own economic hub of activity. So if you want to access recreation, work, or anything else, you physically need to leave the area that you're in. And in order to do that, you need transportation. But the barrier of transportation is so wide that we're still unable to move economically and just socially. Accessible mobility is actually a key way to mitigate the disparity between those of us who live in city centers and those who don't. For the most part, economic activity, jobs, and recreational activities, and all of those cute things still exist in economic hubs, far from poor people and even where middle class people live. But public transportation does nothing to fix this. We don't have lines, train lines, bus lines, and routes that take you into key sectors. And the remedial efforts of those to rectify those things have been buses and taxis, which are largely inefficient. And not to mention, buses and taxis still take up space on our roads, which are already overburdened and too busy. One way that you can mitigate those problems is by creating proper, robust infrastructure for railroads, which are much, much easier to access, faster, and more efficient. We just have not done that. So without mobility, we're not able to be socially mobile either. Per one paper entitled An Analysis of the Quality of Public Transport in Johannesburg, South Africa, using an adapted SERVQUAL method, not sure what that is, urban transport problems severely hamper mobility and accessibility, thus impacting social and economic activities, and that the poor are the worst affected. This was also recognized by Nqaleni, Deputy Director General of Intergovernmental Relations, who stated that the main point to remember is that public transport is essential to creating and growing competitive economies. This in turn is critical for poverty alleviation and also for environmental issues in reducing both carbon emissions and fuel consumption. So basically, this governmental person is like acknowledging the discrepancy between the services rendered and what we really need, but still nothing is being done about it. And the Development Bank of South Africa also recognizes that the lack of mobility has far-reaching implications. They've said that the reality is that transport and poverty in South Africa are linked. And as many rely heavily on public transportation to get to work and seek employment. However, the challenges make it harder for citizens to get jobs, which expands the unemployment gap. So, very little is actually being done to address these issues, even though there have been papers written at length, newspaper articles written at length, people complaining at length every single day whenever they take the train. But still, nothing is being done. This is in large part due to corruption and the fact that the Zuma era completely plundered our state resources, kind of like how our drought brought Cape Town to its knees. It's the same level of severity. In fact, whenever plans are made, they're often scrapped and abandoned. And what we have instead is this thriving, corrupt infrastructure that's really working for the few. A lot of the corruption here, a lot of the corruption information rather, is from Unite Behind, who have a very good handle on what's been going on. They've summed up things really succinctly, and I'm going to read out a few of what they've said. They have a report titled #FixOurTrains, and this is what they found. At least 14 billion rand has been stolen in illegal tenders. And former public protector Thuli Madonsela recommended in her report titled Derailed that all contracts awarded between 2012 and 2015 worth more than 10 million rand were to be investigated. Only 13 of the 216 contracts reviewed by the Treasury were not corrupt or irregular. That's an astonishing number of contracts. That means that the entire period was just a load of trash and completely unusable, and everybody was wasting their time for such a long time, basically. The Auditor General's report found that about 13.9 billion rand in irregular expenditure during the financial year of 2015 and 2016. That is so much money. There is so many trains. There is so many opportunities missed for South Africans to be able to get where they want to go, do what they want to do, and not have to worry about a delayed train impacting their lives, their jobs, their families, getting home on time for supper, not being robbed. These are all things that we need to be super, super concerned about and a lot more riled up about and less blasé. Then there's the saga of the time that we bought a bunch of trains to the tune of over 5 billion rand, and those trains didn't fit the tracks. This was a big story when it first came out, but it's since died down, and we've sort of just accepted what we're left with, which are a handful of new trains, and I'm not really sure if they work effectively at all. Some politician named Oswald Mashaba rigged the tender process and walked away with over 800 million rand in kickbacks. And that's a lot of money for someone to just walk away with from an irregular contract. That's money that could have been used so well for the rest of us. It's quite frankly astonishing. To cap things, because of this corruption, PRASA is actually not making money. They're hemorrhaging money. They're unable to use the money that they do have to put them towards new trains and new infrastructure and things that work. And because nobody's using the train anymore, because it's so inefficient, what we have is a decline in ticket sales. And those ticket sales are kind of important for a business like PRASA. Then trains are being vandalized to the point that they cannot run. There is a plan for the Gautrain in Joburg to be expanded to include more people, but the Gautrain is still inaccessible for regular people because it costs more money than a Metro Rail train. So if Metro Rail worked perfectly well, we wouldn't have this problem. There are plans to jack up the services, but we also know that a lot of these things that people say are election ploys. Then in 2006, for example, PRASA unveiled a plan to jack up their services, and the plan went all the way through to 2030, but none of that has been seen through. They had different phases. different plans and implementations, and it's all on their website if you want to go and have a look at it, but none of it has been implemented, because if you go and stand on a train station right now, you'll see very little has been done. In the news also is where the City of Cape Town has drafted a new plan outlining plans to improve the public transport in Cape Town in the next 5 years. Quote, the draft plan sets out how the city intends to create an integrated transport system, one that will address spatial integration to improve the sustainability and efficiency of public transport services, lower the cost of traveling, and reduce commuting time for residents. We'll see how that goes. We know that the City of Cape Town has a tendency to only cater towards the rich white areas and not so much any other area that matters. So I'm not exactly holding thumbs for this to work out really well. Then there are also plans in various places to devolve the train system so that it becomes a municipality issue and not a statewide issue. If we look at only a few failing municipalities, you can see glaring issues with this proposal, but we've yet to see any of those plans take fruition. Now, there may be other initiatives that I haven't taken into account, but what it really comes down to is without action from PRASA and without decisiveness from the government, very little is being done for us. What we can do is give money towards organizations like Unite Behind and make our voices heard at the polls. As South Africans, we need to be a little bit more active about what we care about and holding government officials to account. I think we've become, not blasé is the right word, but I think we've become quite burnt out by the lack of answers and the lack of accountability in this country. So I would encourage you to donate to organizations like Unite Behind, who are actively trying to help. And when you go to a rally or look at politicians online, make sure that you see what are the things that they are dealing with and what they've addressed in their manifestos. That's it from me. I'm sorry that it's such a sad situation, but like what must happen? Subscribe to this podcast. You can listen to the podcast in audio form, and I've put all the links for that below. Please support, buy me a coffee if you can, and thank you so much for watching.